You throw out moldy bread after 3 days. Medieval peasants stored theirs for 6 months, and it stayed perfect. They weren't lucky. They knew something about food science we've completely forgotten, and it didn't involve refrigerators or chemicals. Ever wonder why your grandmother's ham could hang in the basement for months without turning into a science experiment? Well, medieval folks figured out something we've mostly forgotten in our rush toward refrigeration. They knew how to make food last without plugging anything into a wall. Let's start with smoking because, honestly, it's the most delicious way to prevent your dinner from becoming someone else's bacterial buffet. Medieval cooks weren't just tossing meat over a campfire and calling it a day. Nope, they turned smoking into an art form that would make modern pitmasters weep with envy. The process worked like this. Wood smoke contains natural chemicals that act like tiny bouncers, kicking harmful bacteria to the curb before they can set up shop in your food. But here's where it gets interesting. They had two main techniques that were as different as your chatty neighbor and your mysterious one. Hot smoking cooked the meat while preserving it, kind of like getting a tan and a haircut at the same time. The temperature stayed around 160 to 200 degrees, and your bacon was ready in hours. Cold smoking? That was the marathon runner of preservation. We're talking temperatures below 90 degrees for days, sometimes weeks. Your great-great-grandfather had more patience than a saint waiting for his ham to finish its smoke bath. But the payoff was incredible. Meat that could outlast some marriages. And here's the brilliant part that modern food scientists tip their hats to. That smoky flavor wasn't just for taste. It was culinary camouflage. When meat started getting a little funky around the edges, that rich, smoky taste covered up the early signs of spoilage better than cologne covers up a teenager's gym clothes. The medieval Europeans turned this into a trade empire. Smoked fish traveled hundreds of miles without spoiling, creating the world's first portable protein subscription service. Fishermen along the coasts of England and Scandinavia built entire economies around perfectly smoked herring and cod that could survive journeys that would kill fresh fish 3 times over. But, and this is crucial, they learned the hard way that more isn't always better. Too much smoke turned their prized meat bitter enough to make grown Vikings cry. Finding that sweet spot between preservation and palatability took generations to master. Those medieval smokehouses weren't just buildings, they were time machines that stretched the life of food from days to months. Each one represented knowledge passed down through families like precious heirlooms, because knowing how to smoke properly meant the difference between eating well and starving when winter stretched longer than expected. But smoking was just one trick in their preservation playbook. Wait until you discover what they could accomplish with nothing more than salt and patience. If you thought smoking was clever, wait until you hear about salt. Medieval folks treated this white crystal like liquid gold, and honestly, they weren't wrong. Salt was so valuable that Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in it. That's where we get the phrase, worth your salt. But here's the kicker. They figured out that rubbing salt all over meat could make it last for months without a single ice cube in sight. The science behind salting is beautifully simple. Salt sucks moisture out of meat like a vacuum cleaner on steroids. Bacteria need water to throw their little spoilage parties, so when you remove all the moisture, you're basically canceling their rave before it starts. Makes sense, right? Medieval butchers would pack beef and pork in so much salt, it looked like they were preparing for a snowball fight. The salt would pull out every drop of water over several days, leaving behind what essentially became edible leather. Sounds appetizing, doesn't it? Well, actually, it was pretty tasty once you knew what to do with it. Here's where it gets interesting. Salted beef could survive ocean voyages that lasted months. Think about those poor sailors stuck on wooden ships with no refrigeration, no grocery stores, and definitely no food delivery apps. Their survival literally depended on properly salted meat. One batch of bad curing could mean the difference between reaching land and becoming fish food. The French became absolute masters at this technique. Living along the Atlantic coast, they had access to sea salt from marshes that stretched for miles. French salt-cured ham became so famous that people would travel days just to taste it. It's like the medieval version of driving across town for good barbecue, except the journey involved horses and much more questionable bathroom facilities. But here's the tricky part. Too little salt, and your meat would rot faster than a politician's promise. Too much salt, and you'd end up with something harder than your grandmother's fruitcake. Medieval cooks had to find that sweet spot through pure trial and error. No YouTube tutorials or cooking shows to guide them. The process wasn't exactly fast food friendly either. Proper salt curing took weeks, sometimes months. Patience wasn't just a virtue back then, it was a survival skill. They'd hang huge slabs of salted meat in cool, dry places, checking them regularly like nervous parents watching their kids' first steps. And here's something that might surprise you. The same salting techniques that fed medieval armies are still used today. That prosciutto you pay premium prices for? It's made using methods that haven't changed much in 800 years. Then there's the rehydration trick. Rock-hard salted meat could be brought back to life in soups and stews, adding flavor that would make your taste buds dance. But speaking of adding flavor while preserving food, medieval cooks had another ace up their sleeves that involved something much more sour. Now here's where medieval cooks got really creative, and a bit sour about it. Pickling wasn't just some trendy fermentation fad your hipster neighbor discovered. Medieval folks mastered this technique because, frankly, they had no choice. Vinegar became their best friend. The stuff was like a medieval superhero cape for food. Wrap anything in that acidic embrace, and bacteria would throw up their tiny hands in defeat. Makes sense, right? Those microorganisms hate acid more than your grandfather hates modern music. But here's the thing everyone misses about medieval pickling. They didn't just dump vegetables in vinegar and call it a day. These people were surprisingly sophisticated. They created brines with specific salt concentrations, added herbs for flavor complexity, and timed everything perfectly. Your great-great-great-grandmother would laugh at your Pinterest pickle attempts. Cabbage transformed into sauerkraut through careful fermentation. Cucumbers became pickled delights that could survive months without refrigeration. Even fruits got the pickle treatment. Pickled pears and apples were common winter staples. The medieval pantry looked like a science experiment, but it worked. Well, there was one tiny problem. Everything tasted intensely sour or salty. Medieval dinner parties weren't exactly known for subtle flavors, but when your alternative was starvation or food poisoning, you learned to love that pucker-inducing tang. The Germans perfected sauerkraut to an art form. They discovered that fermented cabbage not only lasted through brutal winters, but actually became more nutritious. Those clever folks were accidentally creating probiotics centuries before anyone knew what gut health meant. Your modern kombucha obsession? Medieval peasants were already there. And the weird part is how they figured out the perfect acidity levels. No pH strips, no scientific instruments, just generations of trial and error. Too weak, and your pickles turned into mushy disappointments. Too strong, and they became inedible acid bombs that could probably clean rust off armor. French monasteries became pickle laboratories. Monks had time, patience, and access to quality vinegars from their wine production. They experimented with different vegetables, creating recipes that monasteries guarded like state secrets. Brother Francois probably wasn't sharing his legendary pickled turnip formula with the neighboring abbey. Then there's the travel factor. Pickled foods were perfect for long journeys because they actually improved with time. While fresh bread turned into rocks and meat spoiled, pickled vegetables remained crunchy and flavorful. Medieval merchants loaded their carts with pickled provisions, creating the world's first portable preserved meals. The technique spread faster than gossip in a medieval village. Every region developed signature pickle styles using local ingredients. What started as necessity became cultural identity. Let's not forget that this pickling obsession solved another crucial problem. But the real genius wasn't in the vegetables they pickled, it was in discovering how to preserve their most precious ingredients using nothing but the power of the sun itself. When medieval folks couldn't smoke, salt, or pickle their food, they turned to something even simpler: drying. And boy, did they master this technique like your grandmother mastered guilt trips. Sundrying was their version of meal prep, except it lasted months instead of a sad week in your fridge. Grapes became raisins. Plums transformed into prunes. Apples turned into chewy rings that could survive longer than most medieval marriages. The process was brilliant in its simplicity. Just remove the water, and bacteria basically threw in the towel. But here's where it gets interesting. Medieval people didn't just dry fruits for snacks. They dried everything. Vegetables, herbs, even meat strips that made modern jerky look like fine dining. Mushrooms hung from rafters like edible Christmas ornaments. Herbs dangled in bundles, ready to turn bland winter stews into something resembling actual food. The science behind this? Pure genius. Bacteria need moisture to party and multiply. Take away their swimming pool and they're done. Medieval folks figured this out centuries before anyone understood what bacteria even were. They just knew it worked, probably after watching their great-aunt's dried pears outlast 3 different kings. Well, the process wasn't always foolproof. Over-dry your food and you'd end up chewing something with the texture of leather boots. Under-dry it and you'd discover mold colonies that could claim their own citizenship. Finding that sweet spot required more skill than threading a needle while riding a horse. Then there's the rehydration game. Dried foods needed coaxing back to life in soups and stews. Medieval cooks became masters at this resurrection act, turning rock-hard vegetables into tender morsels that actually tasted like food again. Some dried fruits got the luxury treatment, soaked in wine or honey water until they resembled their former selves. And the variety was incredible. Peas, beans, onions, garlic, everything got the drying treatment. Herbs weren't just preserved, they became concentrated flavor bombs that could transform the most boring porridge into something worth eating. Dried mint, thyme, and sage turned medieval kitchens into aromatic sanctuaries. But why stop at vegetables and fruits? Medieval folks dried fish too, creating protein sources that could travel anywhere without spoiling. Cod became so hard you could probably use it as a weapon, but soak it properly and dinner was served. The abundance of dried foods meant winter didn't have to equal starvation. Smart. Medieval families could feast on summer's bounty even when snow covered the ground for months. Their pantries looked like natural grocery stores, filled with concentrated nutrition and flavor. However, mastering the drying game was just one piece of the preservation puzzle. Medieval people had another trick up their sleeves that not only preserved food, but actually made it healthier and more delicious through a process that seemed almost magical. Medieval people discovered something our modern world is just catching up to. Fermentation wasn't just about preserving food, it was about making it healthier. While we're paying $15 for a tiny jar of kimchi at Whole Foods, they were fermenting everything in sight without even knowing about probiotics. Sauerkraut became their secret weapon against scurvy and sickness. Sailors packed barrels of this tangy cabbage on long voyages, not because they loved the taste, but because it kept them alive when fresh vegetables were a distant memory. The Germans perfected this art so well that sauerkraut became practically synonymous with their culture. One barrel could feed a family through winter while actually improving their gut health. But here's where it gets interesting. Medieval folks weren't just fermenting vegetables. They were turning everything into alcohol. Ale wasn't a luxury. It was safer than water. When your local water source looked like chocolate milk and probably contained more diseases than a medieval hospital, a nice frothy ale was actually the responsible choice. Monks became the ultimate fermentation masters. These guys had time, dedication, and divine motivation. They crafted ales, meads, and cheeses that would make modern artisanal producers weep with envy. Some monasteries became famous across Europe just for their brewing skills. Talk about finding your calling. The beauty of fermentation lies in its simplicity. You basically trick bacteria into doing your preservation work for you. The good bacteria crowd out the bad ones, creating an environment where harmful microbes can't survive. It's like having a bouncer at your food's nightclub, except this bouncer works for centuries. Cheese represented fermentation's crown jewel. Medieval cheesemakers developed techniques so sophisticated that some methods remain unchanged today. They understood aging, temperature control, and flavor development without any scientific instruments. Just experience, intuition, and probably a lot of happy accidents. Well, fermented beverages solved another massive problem. Clean drinking water was rarer than a unicorn in medieval times. The alcohol content in fermented drinks killed harmful bacteria that would otherwise cause serious illness. Parents literally gave children diluted ale instead of water. Different times indeed. The fermentation process created foods that could last months or even years. Properly fermented sauerkraut stayed edible longer than most marriages back then. The lactic acid produced during fermentation acted like nature's own preservative system, keeping food safe without any artificial additives. Medieval people accidentally created superfoods before anyone knew what vitamins were. Fermented foods increased nutritional value while extending shelf life. They turned ordinary cabbage into vitamin C powerhouses and grain into digestible, nutritious beverages. Then there's the flavor factor. Fermentation didn't just preserve food, it transformed it into something completely different and often more delicious. But even the most ingenious fermentation couldn't solve every preservation challenge, especially when it came to storing large quantities of fresh produce through harsh winters. Picture your grandmother's basement, that musty, cool space where she stored her preserves. Medieval folks basically turned that concept into an art form. They dug root cellars that worked like nature's own refrigerator, maintaining temperatures around 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. No electric bill required. These weren't just random holes in the ground, mind you. Medieval people positioned their cellars with the precision of modern architects. Too shallow? Your turnips would freeze solid in winter. Too deep? Well, you'd be digging in China and still not storing a single potato. The earth itself became their insulation system. Think of it like wrapping your house in the world's thickest blanket, one that never needs washing and keeps the same temperature whether it's blazing summer or bitter winter outside. Smart, right? Root vegetables were the superstars of cellar storage. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, and parsnips could hang out underground for months without going bad. They'd layer these vegetables in sand or straw, creating little vegetable hotels where each guest had its own comfortable bed. No touching allowed. One rotten apple really did spoil the bunch, but here's where it gets interesting. Medieval cellars weren't just vegetable storage units. They stored wheels of cheese, barrels of ale, and even preserved meats. The consistent cool temperature slowed down bacterial growth better than leaving food in a medieval kitchen, where temperatures swung wildly depending on whether the fire was roaring or dying down. Then there's the ventilation factor most people forget about. These cellars needed just enough airflow to prevent moisture buildup, but not so much that temperatures fluctuated. Medieval builders created clever ventilation systems using stone channels and wooden pipes. They basically invented climate control 500 years before anyone knew what climate control was. The wealthy took this concept even further. Castle cellars resembled underground cities with separate chambers for different foods. Wine got its own room. Grain had special bins. Even butter had designated cool spots. It was like having a medieval Costco warehouse beneath your feet. And the results? Apples, stored in properly maintained cellars, could last until spring. Cabbages stayed crisp through winter. Root vegetables maintained their nutritional value for months on end. Your modern refrigerator might keep food cold, but it certainly doesn't maintain the same romantic atmosphere as a stone-walled medieval cellar. Of course, not everyone had access to perfect cellaring conditions. Poor families made do with shallow pits covered by wooden boards and straw. Still better than leaving everything out in the open, but definitely the economy version of medieval cold storage. What's fascinating is how this simple technology shaped medieval society's entire relationship with seasonal eating. Fresh food in summer, preserved treasures from the cellar in winter. Speaking of preserving treasures, medieval cooks discovered something even sweeter than successful cellaring: natural preservatives that actually made food taste better. Who knew that sticky golden goo could be mankind's secret weapon against food rot? Honey wasn't just something medieval folks drizzled on their bread. It was basically nature's ultimate preservative. And frankly, it makes our modern chemical preservatives look like amateur hour. Here's where things get fascinating. Honey naturally contains less than 18% water, which makes it absolutely hostile territory for bacteria. Think of bacteria as tiny drama queens who desperately need moisture to survive. Without it, they shrivel up and die faster than your motivation on a Monday morning. But wait, there's more to this sweet story. Honey produces hydrogen peroxide when it contacts wound fluids or gets diluted. Yes, the same stuff your grandmother used to clean cuts also happens naturally in honey. Medieval people didn't understand the science, but they definitely noticed that fruits preserved in honey stayed fresh for months while everything else turned into medieval compost. The real kicker? Archaeologists have found pots of honey in Egyptian tombs that are over 3,000 years old, and they're still perfectly edible. Meanwhile, that yogurt in your fridge expires next Tuesday, and you're already suspicious of it. Sugar played a similar role, though it was rarer than a parking spot at the mall during Christmas shopping. When medieval cooks could get their hands on sugar, usually imported at astronomical costs, they'd create conserves that lasted through entire winters. The high concentration of sugar works just like honey, sucking moisture out of harmful microorganisms until they give up on life entirely. Medieval households would preserve whole fruits by coating them in honey or sugar syrup. Apricots, pears, even rose petals got the sweet treatment. The result was something that could sit in storage for months without spoiling, though it probably had enough sugar to send a modern dentist into cardiac arrest. Then there's the brilliant medieval logic of making mead, honey wine that combined preservation with, shall we say, improved mood management. The alcohol and honey work together like the ultimate preservation tag team, keeping the drink safe while making long winter nights considerably more bearable. Here's what really gets me, though. These medieval preservers were essentially creating candy that doubled as survival food. Honey-preserved fruits were so concentrated with sweetness that a small piece could provide serious energy, perfect for travelers, soldiers, or anyone facing a harsh winter. The wealthy would show off their honey-preserved delicacies at feasts, serving up fruits that were completely out of season. Imagine the medieval equivalent of serving fresh strawberries in January, except their method actually worked without requiring a global shipping network and industrial refrigeration. And here's the beautiful irony. We've spent centuries developing artificial preservatives when bees had already perfected the formula. Sometimes the old ways weren't just good enough, they were absolutely brilliant.